You read the book. Have you ever counted your own respirations?
Yeah, I'm low.
It's kind of hard, isn't it? Because whenever you think about how fast you're breathing, you can alter how fast you're breathing. And so for those of you that go into nursing, that's one of the vital signs. You'll take the blood pressure, you'll check their pulse, and you don't tell them that you're counting their breath. You sit there and put your hand on their wrist. You kind of look like you're looking at your watch, and you're not counting their pulse. All you're doing is counting their breathing. But it's very hard, looking at most people, to count their breaths. But if you don't do it kind of on the sly like that, you'll never get a real number. So counting respiratory rate is always kind of an art.
I like using the mirror as I'm washing my hands.
Yeah, you can do it in the mirror.
You can see in the mirror, you can wash your hands and wash them.
You can tell them that you're gonna retake their blood pressure, and if they don't think about it.
Yeah. The point being, you guys have all got it. I mean, the point being, if you tell somebody I'm going to count your breathing, they'll hold their breath or they'll breathe too fast or whatever.
With the group home that I worked at, whenever you tell them you're counting, they just stop. They just basically start holding their breath every time.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about this other term. We talked about tidal volume, the amount that we move in and out, but let's talk about anatomic dead space. Now, the point with this anatomic dead space is that only a part of what we breathe in, if you're measuring it at your mouth here, only a part of it does you any good. The only part that does you any good is the part that gets all the way down into an alveolus, right? So if all the air does is fill up your trachea, back of your mouth, your pharynx, fill up your trachea, fills up your bronchia, primary bronchus, secondary bronchus, third level bronchus. Those are just tubes, remember? That air is not doing you any good, and that's called anatomic dead space. So it's stuff you breathed in, but it did not allow you to absorb any of the oxygen out of it or to send any carbon dioxide to it. Now, the story I always tell about that is that I usually have a piece of plastic tubing in my bag with me, which I don't have. But let's just say I took a piece of tubing about this long, or say a hose, a garden hose, about that long, and I put it on my mouth, and I'm going to... What have I done when I breathe through a tube?
You've created extra dead space.
I've created extra anatomic dead space. Because now, until I breathe all of that air from down in my lungs out of the end of the tube, I haven't really gotten rid of it. And I have to pull air in until I've not only filled the tube, but filled all my own dead space before it's really doing me any good. That's dead space. Now, just so you know, in the ICU, you can actually screw with people's dead space. In other words, if their PCO2 is too low, and you want them to breathe less, they're breathing off their CO2 too fast, you can actually put a little extra dead space. You put a little extra piece of tube in the breathing system. Changes their dead space, changes their PCO2. Probably doesn't change their oxygen level. But that's also the reason why you can't take a hose and go to the bottom of the pool and breathe from the bottom of the pool. Because there's no way you could pull air all the way down, all of that dead space, and then all the way back out and actually get any good from it. Make sense? Yeah.
So when we breathe in and held our breath, you said it changed a bunch of stuff. Does it work the same if we breathe completely out and then just don't take another breath in?
No. No. It doesn't matter whether you do it when you're holding it in or when you're holding it out.
Doesn't change a thing?
Not really. The first breath would change a little bit, that's it. Okay, so the point, an even more important term to understand is what's called alveolar ventilation. We talked about ventilation, minute ventilation, which is the amount you suck in through your mouth and goes out through your mouth, right, which includes the anatomic dead space. But what you really want to calculate when you're talking about how much is somebody breathing is how much is actually getting down into their lungs. Okay? So the way you would figure that, to figure alveolar ventilation, the formula would be take the tidal volume the amount you go in and out through your mouth, subtract the anatomic dead space, the part that's not doing you any good, multiply that by the respiratory rate. Okay, it's going to be less, obviously, alveolar ventilation is always going to be less than minute ventilation, but that's how you get it, it's because of the dead space. Yes, ma'am?
So is there kind of like an average anatomic dead space, or is it dependent on each individual?
You know, I want to say it's about 30%. I have a site I usually send you to after we do this lab today. Let's talk about the gas that's in the down in the alveoli. First of all, when air that we breathe in gets down to our alveoli, what happens to it? Does it get more or less oxygen? Well, the air in the alveolus gets the oxygen taken out of it, right? So the alveolar oxygen gets lower, and PCO2, the CO2, which is unloading itself as it's going through your lung, is going to get higher, okay? So sure enough, the alveoli down at the bottom of the lung contain less oxygen and more CO2 than the air on the outside. There's one other major difference between air down there and air on the outside. What might that be?
The fact that a lot of it was in the dead space. Maybe?
Well, let me give you a little hint.
More nitrogen. Oh, it's like,
Water vapor. Water, the air in your lungs, by the time it gets to the bottom of your lungs, is completely humidified. So that every time we breathe out, we're breathing water out. Got it? All right. And so you got water vapor in there as well.
That jumped about 4 slides from you.
It did?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Oh, yeah, this is good. So alveolar ventilation rate is basically, I think we've talked enough about this. Let's talk about Superman for a minute. Kind of a nice looking guy, isn't he? What was his name?
Christopher Reeve
Christopher Reeve, yeah. You know what happened to Christopher Reeve?
fell off a horse.
Yeah.
His horse spooked.
He was riding a horse and he was competing in this big horsing event just outside of Washington, D.C. And he goes over one of these things, and then the horse decides he doesn't want, so he throws Christopher, and Christopher goes off, and Christopher landed like that, and the horse didn't. He broke his neck, and I can tell you that Christopher Reeve was actually dead right there. He could not breathe at all. Luckily, there was an anesthesiologist nearby as part of the first aid team that had a light, a laryngoscope, and an endotracheal tube. And as soon as he saw that Christopher could not breathe, he intubated him, rolled him over, straightened his head, put a tube in his trachea, and then they could bag him and make him breathe. He could not move any of these muscles we've been talking about all day because he was paralyzed at the C1 level, the top vertebrae level. This is his x-ray, and here's his first vertebrae up here, and it's just in pieces. So basically he had cut his spinal cord right up there at the C1 level, and he couldn't breathe at all. Now, here's the point. What nerve innervates your diaphragm?
The phrenic.
The phrenic nerve. And where does the phrenic nerve come from?
2, 3, 4, 5.
3, 4, 5. C3, C4, C5, right here in the neck. So if you break your neck anywhere below C5, which most everybody does, because most neck injuries are caused by this sort of thing, and it breaks it down at 7 or 8, sometimes 6, but 6, 7, or 8, let's just say. Those people can breathe just fine. Why? Because their diaphragm still works just fine, because their phrenic nerve works just fine. But if you break your neck above the C3 level, you cannot breathe at all. All of those muscles down here in the chest, the only way they need you, you know, I mean, the first intercostal works off of T1, right? Second intercostal works off of the T2 level of your spinal cord. So we're talking about the upper ones, and he didn't have them. So that did two things for him. Number one, it completely paralyzed him from the neck down. He could not breathe a bit. He had a tracheostomy put in him the next day, and he had a ventilator in the back of his wheelchair here. His wheelchair was electrified so that he could he just worked it with his mouth. He could move his mouth a little bit to make it go right, left, and so forth. And he actually did a little bit more acting. He made a couple of movies in which he played the part of a quadriplegic. This is his wife. I think her name was Dana. What's really sad is that he died 10 years later, and that's a very long time for a quadriplegic to live. Quadriplegics usually die at the rate of about 6 or 7% a year. Why? Because they can't move, they can't shift, they get sores on their butt, they get pulmonary emboli, blood clots form, all kinds of urinary tract infections because they can't really pee well, so they have to have a catheter in all the time, which keeps their urine infected all the time. It's really a bad deal. Anyway, he had a reaction to an antibiotic that killed him, but he'd been on constant antibiotics basically since he was first injured because of that. And interestingly, his wife died 2 years later. That young, beautiful lady died of lung cancer.
And she's never smoked.
I don't know that.
No, she didn't. She never smoked.
She didn't smoke?
Yeah, that was part of the thing. She never smoked.
Yeah. All right, so this is what we're going to do in the lab today on ourselves. You guys are going to measure your own ventilator volumes, and it works kind of like this. Here you are taking nice, deep, nice, regular, quiet breathing. This is your tidal volume. So the difference between this volume and that volume is your tidal volume. And then when you get to the end of one of those, you kind of breathe out regularly. And then you see how much more you can push out. Okay? And that amount that you can push out from this point is called the expiratory reserve volume. In other words, it's how much more you can push out. And then you breathe a few more tidal volumes along in here, and then you get to the end of one of those so that you're right at this point, and your teammate says, take a deep breath, take a deep breath, deep breath, deep breath, deep breath. Then you suck in as much air as you can, and that gets you up here. That's called your inspiratory reserve volume. So this is expiratory reserve volume, inspiratory reserve volume. That takes you up to the very top. That is the fullest full that your lungs can ever be, okay, when you suck in every bit you can suck in. And then they tell you, okay, now blow it all out, blow every bit out, and this is another cheering thing. They cheer you on to try to get you to blow out more, and you get all the way back down to here, and this is your emptiest empty. So this point here is the emptiest empty that your lungs can ever get to. And the difference between fullest full and emptiest empty is called your vital capacity. And if you're a vital active person, you'd like to think you have a big vital capacity, and that's pretty much true. And then you go back into this. Now what about these volumes down here at the bottom? Well, the residual volume, what that is that's telling you that you can't ever blow all the air out. First of all, you can't blow the dead space out. You can't blow the volume that's in the tubes, because the tubes aren't going to contract down to nothing, right? So they're always going to stay full of air. And so, but we don't really have to worry about these below here. This last one, the minimal volume, and I think really even the residual volume, those are just why bodies float. Because you can't ever get all the air out of you, so bodies tend to float if you're dead. And really the only value of these two numbers is to see how much more air there is in the lungs when someone's dead. How's that sound for an answer? So, vital capacity in males, oftentimes IRV 3,300, ERV 1,000, vital capacity 500, residual volume down here at the bottom 1,200, for a total of 6,000 milliliters of total lung capacity. But like I said, the only ones that are really important are from here up, because these are the ones we actually breathe with. Females are a lot smaller, and you can see here their pulmonary volumes are a lot less. I must admit, I'm always amazed, having run a few marathons and gotten beat by thousands of women in those races. It still amazes me that when you take men and women and line them up and run them in the same marathon, the men will generally finish about 15 minutes before the women. And indeed, the world record for men is like 2:03, and the world's record for women is about 2:20, maybe 2:21. That's kind of amazing to me, that there's that much difference. And it's not so much in their size and the length of their stride, their height, or anything like that. It's simply the amount of oxygen they can process, and it's all related to their testosterone levels, because we know that testosterone not only makes you grow bigger and makes your bones get stronger and get bigger and muscles get bigger, but it also makes all these enzymes work faster that you use to process the oxygen with and so forth. Yeah?
So if a female patient gets a lung transplant from a male patient, are there...
Boy, that would really suck. I'm just kidding. Maybe it would
No, it
blow.
only
Maybe it
sucks
would
the
blow.
Only if it was the other way
Will there
around.
be changes in the way that the lungs function because there's no longer the testosterone?
No.
Okay.
No. The patient would be on anti-rejection medicines in the first place and would override anything else.
No.
Yeah.
No, the relation between the full is full and the empty is empty for vital capacity was what exactly? It was plus or minus for the vital capacity.
This is vital capacity right here, from that point to this point, from the fullest full to the emptiest empty.
The plus or minus are just the actual space.
It's just a volume. Yeah. Pulmonary function tests are something we used to often order in the hospital. You would take a patient who you were going to operate on the next day and say, Mrs. Jones, you don't look like you're breathing all that good. Let's make sure you can afford to undergo this surgery and you can survive this. And we would send them up to the pulmonary function lab, and they would do all these volumes and all these tests, kind of like what you're going to do on yourself here in a little while. And basically, I think if you ever get a chance to go with one of your patients to the pulmonary function lab, go. You'll be amazed. These pulmonary function people, and they have a very important job in the hospital because they usually take care of all the ventilators and all the blood gases and all that kind of stuff that really ties into what we're doing this chapter. But they also do the pulmonary function tests. And you think it's just like a bunch of cheerleading. They go, okay, now listen, what we're going to do is you take this and you put it in your mouth, and when I say take a deep breath, you take as deep a breath as you can. And then you're sitting there cheering, come on, breathe, 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 breathe. You know, and it's like craziness in there. But that's how they do it. And it really is, because of the fact that our breathing is controlled by us, especially if we're thinking about it. Okay. I'm going to show you the video when we get over there. Gas exchange, I think we've talked about all of this, but let me just kind of as a review here. The gas exchange occurs between the blood in those pulmonary capillaries and the alveolar air inside of the alveoli. And that occurs very quickly as the blood flows through those capillary beds, 2 or 3 or 4 seconds, and it drops off all of its CO2, and it picks up all of its O2. Now, not all of it, but it picks up a lot. The amount that it drops off and the amount that it picks up depends on the partial pressures of the gases. Obviously, if there isn't enough oxygen in the air, then you don't have oxygen to pick up. If you have super high oxygen concentrations, like you've got a face mask on that's breathing pure oxygen, then you're going to have a lot more oxygen to pick up, and you will pick up a lot more. A little bit more. We'll talk about that. Keep those things in mind, and we'll kind of go through this with the gas laws. Diffusion occurs in response to the concentration gradients, and all of the diffusion and all of the gradients depend on all of the laws of pressure. that we'll talk about. We've already talked about Boyle's law. Boyle's was the syringe. Put your finger on the end of the syringe, you push it down, the pressure goes up, the volume goes down. Right? Volume and pressure are inversely related. You also need to know what's normal air. Okay? And normal air is about 79% nitrogen. Wait a minute, we haven't really talked about nitrogen at all, have we? But yet it's 79% of this stuff right here is nitrogen. Well, the deal is that nitrogen is very, very slow to go across membranes and to go into cells. So, it's very, very slow to come into our bodies and very slow to come out of our bodies, but since we've been around here for a few years, we've actually become saturated with nitrogen. Okay, we're full of nitrogen, it just doesn't do anything for us, so we never talk about it. Okay? Oxygen is very quick to absorb in and go out. It's only about 21%. You think, well, 21% and 78% and 70, almost 79%, that's like 100% right there, huh? Well, it's not quite, but it's pretty close. Water vapor, relative humidity, basically, is about 0.5%. And the last one is carbon dioxide. Now, just for all of you climate change skeptics out there that think it came from China, let me tell you that we've been measuring carbon dioxide levels for about 1,500 years. You say, well, how have we been doing that? We didn't have carbon dioxide monitors. Well, you can take and bore a hole down in through the Arctic ice, and then you can pull that out, and you can measure year by year the snow that fell in 1422, and then you can measure what the carbon dioxide level was in that year by analyzing the gas that's in that water, that's in that ice, that's in the Arctic. Now, 0.04, think, oh, that's like negligible, no big deal. Well, we're to the point where in the next few years, this is going to go over 0.04. It's going to be 0.042 or 0.043. And we know that it only takes a very tiny amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere to act as a greenhouse so that the heat can come in, but it can't get out. And so as we change the amount of carbon dioxide in our whole atmosphere, we're talking up to, what, 30 miles or so above the Earth, that's our atmosphere, we're changing the amount of that by a tiny bit, but yet it's making a huge difference already. Now, you may wonder, well, what's the big deal? I mean, all that crap we're burning, all that fossil fuel and stuff we're burning, is got carbon in it, right? Where did oil come from? Remember, back in the old dinosaur stories you used to be told, you know, there was a lot of mud pits and there was a lot of bogs, and there was lots of basically original forests. And most of the world was covered with trees and forests. Those all fell down. They rotted, and they went down in the ground, and you know, a million years later, they've gotten compressed and compressed and compressed and turned into oil. Okay, so all the carbon that is in oil has been millions of years in the making. The problem is we're going to burn every bit of it in about 200 years at the rate we're going. Every drop of petroleum will be gone in another couple hundred years if we keep burning it at the rate we're burning it. And every time you burn a molecule of oil, there are usually these long, like fatty acid things, you remember those guys that sometimes have 20 carbons in them, and there's energy in every bond. And when you light off a piece of wood or a piece of coal or a piece of natural gas or a piece of gasoline, you're releasing that carbon. That's the problem. The problem is that it took millions of years to get into the ground, and now we're burning it all up in a couple of hundred years at the rate we're going. That's what the problem is. Anyway, whoa, boy, you got off track there, didn't he? No, he didn't. I think it's really important that you understand it. So even though this number is very small, it's very, very significant. And it has come up from about 0.03 when we first could measure it until now it's over 0.04. Atmosphere, a couple of laws. Here's another one, Dalton's law. Dalton's law says that in order to get the 760 millimeters of mercury, you have to add up the atmospheric pressure of every gas. So, if nitrogen is 79% of the gas, then nitrogen is providing 79% of 760 in terms of the pressure. Okay? The oxygen is 21%, so about a fifth of that. So that would be about, what, 130 or so millimeters of mercury comes from the oxygen, and so forth. So just remember that the partial pressures of each gas are added up, and they add up to 760 at sea level. Henry's law is one that I think you probably have thought about before in your life, but you probably never knew it was called Henry's law. Maybe you did. But Henry's law says that whenever gas, like air, is in contact with a liquid, the amount of gas that dissolves into liquid it will reach equilibrium if you leave it in contact long enough. It also varies based on the temperature. Now, figure this. Anybody ever had a glass of ice and you take and pop a can of Coke and you pour the can of Coke in over the ice, and what happens? Bubbles come up out of the Coke, and those bubbles are carbon dioxide. Remember, it's a carbonated beverage, so they shot carbon dioxide in it to make it carbonated. And that carbon dioxide comes up off the Coke. And if you don't have ice in your glass, let's just say you take half of your Coke and pour it into an empty glass, and half of it you pour it into a glass with ice in it, which one is going to stay carbonated the longest? The cold one. Okay? The colder fluids are at, the more gas they hold. Okay? Now that's why salmon like cool streams. It's not because they think, oh, it's so cool, man, I can lay out in the sun. It's because when the water is cool, there's more oxygen in there for them. Okay? And they don't have to run as much water through their gills in order to get enough oxygen. I always tell the story when I was a kid, when I was in medical school, actually down in Arkansas, I had some relatives who owned some rice fields. And to grow rice, you have to be able to make these mile-long little dams, you know, and control the level and smooth the ground out really smooth. And then you fill it all up with water and stick the rice seeds in there, and it grows rice plants. And it has to be full of water all the time, so you just pump water. Well, price of rice went to hell because the Chinese got really good at making rice. And of course, they're really good at eating it as well. And I love rice myself. Every time I eat rice, which is almost every day, I say to my wife, I said, you know what I've always said about rice? And she says, if you say that one more time, you're going to drive me crazy. I said, well, 1 billion Chinese can't be wrong. They love rice, and so do I. So, anyway, so these farmers, now they're not making any money raising rice, so they need a new crop to raise. So they decide they're going to raise catfish. And the state fish and game department down there in Arkansas says, hey, give us a call, we'll bring 250,000, 300, 500,000 baby catfish to your farm and dump them out in your field for you. You just got to keep water on them. So they took all their equipment that they had for making these rice paddies, and they built dams around their field. And most of them were not more than 4 or 5 feet deep. Okay? But you could have an 80-acre pond like that to raise 10 million catfish. And so they would come, and it was kind of interesting because they had these little feeding stations all the way around the fields, and they would drive around in a pickup truck and they would dump bags and bags and barrels of this catfish food, which was like dry dog food. And the catfish would come over and they would bang this little wire that came down, and every time they would bang the wire, a few little kibbles of dry catfish food would fall down there, and all these catfish would just sit around eating it like crazy. And it was so funny to go around the field with the farmer, because when you went from this feeding station to that one, you could look back at the water and you could see like 100,000 catfish swimming towards you. Well, that's all fine and good until it gets really hot. And in the middle of the summer, the fish were really struggling. And the reason they were struggling was because the water was so warm that you couldn't keep enough oxygen in the water to keep them from dying. And so they would go up to the surface. They were starting to do that. They're trying to actually bring mouthfuls of air to run through their gills to get oxygen because they can't get it out of the water. Well, that's the deal here, and the same holds true with the Coke. Now remember, the Coke was carbonated and it was under pressure in the can, and that's why when you open the can it goes shh, and the gas runs out. But then if you want to keep it carbonated, you got to keep it really cold, because of this law right here, Henry's law, that says that any given temperature, the amount of gas is proportional to the partial pressure of that gas. So the carbon dioxide wants to get out, because how much carbon dioxide is there up here in the air? Only 0.04. There's lots more than that in the Coke. So it's trying to get out. But it's very much controlled by the temperature. Yes, ma'am?
So, like, I don't know, I just don't understand this. Like, when you eat cold food, like you were mentioning, like fish or something like that, or salad, like, do you think the gas will build more in our system when we drink even a Coke or something like that? Like, more
If you
gas
drink a
will-
cold Coke, there's going to be a lot more carbon dioxide in the fluid. If you get it down here, you're probably going to have to belch it back up, because as you warm it, now the carbon dioxide will come out in your stomach, and you'll have a stomach full of carbon dioxide, and you'll belch it up. For regular food, not so much. No difference. Okay. Oh, here we go. Here's the unopened soda can. See how close together all the carbon dioxide molecules are? And there's an equilibrium established between here and there. And here's what happens when you release the pressure. You open the can, the carbon dioxide escapes out into the air, and so you get lots of carbon dioxide out here around it and much less in the water. And it's also dependent on temperature. So pressure and temperature and concentration of the gases all make a difference. Gas content, the actual amount of gas in a solution at a given partial pressure, depends on the solubility of that gas